Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. Today we're going to cover Chapter 11, Race and Ethnicity. Let's go and get started. Okay, so the big question is, what is race? And this is this is going to be an important chapter considering everything that's going on currently. We have unprecedented amounts of protests. We have the issue with Black Lives Matter, law enforcement. So there's going to be a lot here, okay? There's a lot going on in this chapter. Okay, so I'm going to try to run through most of it, and we're going to go through a lot. We're going to cover a lot of the concepts. Really what I want to do is I want to focus on some of the concepts that I believe should be the foundation for discussion when it comes to what race is. Okay, and well, the most important thing, if you don't remember anything else from this lecture, just remember that race is a fluid concept. Okay, race is a fluid concept, and because it essentially changes. It's constantly changing. The definition of what race is changes depending on who's applying the concept, or who's the person in power, who's the person not in power. This is if you're looking from a sociological perspective, I would use, you could use conflict theory, you can use functionalism, you can use symbolic interactionism, depending on how you want to frame it. So symbolic interactionism, right? The idea that you're going to go ahead and label certain things, and the label or the meaning you place on things will determine how those things are perceived. So race is one of those things. So if I'm going to go ahead and label one particular group of people as less than, or more criminal, or feeble-minded, if that's the way they're labeled, that's the way people will learn to treat those people, or learn how to, so that's how they would treat those individuals within our society. So like I said, there's a lot going on here, but this is probably the most important thing to understand. The concept of race is fluid. It's constantly changing. Okay, what our classifications now are for race today will change. 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, it'll be something different. Okay, now race is not really concerned with ancestral and familial ties, and is more concerned with superficial and physical characteristics. So what that means is, when we're determining what a person's race is, right? For the reasons why you'd want to do that, it's probably not good. But if you're determining what somebody's race is, you're not really concerned with their ancestry, where they came from, or the familial ties. Okay, who their family is, or where their family's from, things like that. Okay, what you're more concerned with are their appearance, or is their appearance. So you're concerned with their appearance. What do these people look like? What is their hair color? What is their skin color? Facial features. Okay, that's what you're looking at. Okay, so race is really concerned with superficial physical characteristics. You may ask yourself why that is. You can spend an hour just talking about this. One argument for that is, when you associate people, or you classify people, probably a better term. If you classify people based on their physical appearance, and there's certain meanings based or applied to that appearance, then it's easier to identify them. So the idea is, if anybody who has dark skin, this particular hair, or this hair color, we can easily group them as this. Okay, so they're easy to target that way. So race is a fantastic tool when it comes to identifying people. And usually when you identify people, it's usually for mistreatment in some way, shape, or form. Okay, so we're not so much concerned with ancestral familial ties, and more concerned with superficial physical characteristics. Okay, so in the past, categories of race were based on various geographic regions, ethnicities, skin colors, and more. So the concept of race, the way we know it now, is fairly new. Okay. It's something that started to develop in the 1700s, 1800s, and it went through quite a few different changes as far as what the classifications were. But the idea is we're going to start classifying people. Okay, and that brings us to Johann Frederick Blumenbach. Okay, 1752, 1840. I can't remember if all this was. I don't think this was in a textbook. I think this is something that I felt was important to cover. I believe some of it was. Okay, so who is Johann? Okay, Johann was a German anthropologist who argued for the earliest classifications of races of mankind. Now, what he did was he compared physical characteristics, and what he did, essentially what he was looking at was skeletal structure, skulls primarily, I believe, and what he was doing is he was trying to classify the groups of people on the groups of people essentially that would be considered mankind, right? And he developed different races of mankind, and he believed, actually, if I'm not mistaken, that we were all descendant from one type of humanoid, or one type of classification of a race, and all the other 5 races were some kind of a offshoot of that first human. Okay, so what he did is he looked at, like I said, skeletal structure, skulls, and looked for differences. Differences, essentially what he was looking for is patterns. Okay, I'm looking for patterns and skulls from individuals from this area, and I can see that individuals from this area have this particular skull characteristic, okay, that I can't find in other skulls from other groups of individuals from other parts of the world. So he was trying to essentially use skeletal structure, skulls, to determine different races of humans, okay? So, and the term for that would be comparative anatomy. Phrenology would be another one. We'll cover that in a little bit. Okay. So what he came up with was 5 groups of mankind. All right. So 5 races. Let's just do that. So there's 5 races. Okay. The first race was Caucasian, or I believe the term that they used would be Caucasoid. This would be considered the white race. He was the first to use this term for Europeans. Right. So it's Europeans, individuals from the Middle East, and individuals from North Africa, okay, or North African regions. Okay, these individuals would be considered Caucasian. The second would be Mongolian or Mongoloid, so that would be the yellow race, including individuals from East Asians and Central Asians. The third would be Malayan or brown race, including Southeast Asian and Pacific Islanders. Then you had Ethiopian, which would be black race, including Sub-Saharan Africans. And then you had American, so red race, including American Indians. Okay, so this image here would be a pretty good example of the races according to Johann. Okay, so you have your Americans, you have your Malaysians, you have your Caucasians, you have your Ethiopian, and you have your Mongolian. Okay, so this is what it was. This is how individuals were classified. Now, looking at this now, we're going to go ahead and say no. This is not correct. We're not going to buy into this. This is not true. But think about it. And well, he was born in 1752. So let's just say, in the early, or let's say, the late 1700s, early 1800s. You think about how many people were literate. Think how many people were educated in the late 1700s. Who had access to education? Is going to be individuals who are wealthy or affluent, So if you were an affluent individual, you would be able to read this information. You would be able to understand what this information is trying to get across, okay, the points it was trying to make. So if you're an individual who's wealthy or affluent, you're educated, you have the ability to read, you're literate, and you read something from a scientist, an anthropologist, who said that there are 5 races of individuals, then the Caucasian being the white race, and you are part of the Caucasian race, whether you're from Europe, Middle East, or North African regions. And another thing Johann said too was that he considered, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Caucasian to be the best looking or the most developed of the 5 races. Okay, so just a little note there. So Caucasians, according to Johann, was the most advanced and most developed of the 5 races. So, if you are an individual in the European, Middle Eastern, North African region, and you were educated, and you could read something like this, would you not believe it? Right? The idea is that this information is coming from individuals who we would argue would be experts. Okay? So, and experts that are using, if you want to call that, the scientific method, right? So he's looking for patterns in skeletal structures, even though it would be a pseudoscience now. Now we would consider this to be a pseudoscience, but back then it was considered science, and it was conducted by individuals who were experts. They were doctors, they were authorities, leading authorities in the field. You would believe this. You would believe that, yeah, this is correct. I am part of the Caucasian race, which makes me superior to others. This is scientifically proven and backed up. Okay? So if you grew up in a society where this is what was taught to you, why would you believe anything other than this? Okay, that's kind of an important question, to ask ourselves. We are taught information. We're given information. We're taught a certain history. We're taught a certain reality. First, like I said, family is first agent of socialization. Whoever your family is, friends, neighbors, so on and so forth. So if that was how you were socialized, why would you believe anything else other than what's being presented to you? So information is important. Okay, scientific information is really important as far as how it's presented. All right, well, just gonna double down on that idea or that concept, right? So labels for racial groups have suggested regions, and we kind of covered this already, right? Mongolia, Caucasus Mountains, skin tones, essentially black, white, yellow, red, for example, right? So that would be the Johann's, or 5 races, okay? So social science organizations have taken official position. This is important. We've taken this official position rejecting the biological explanations of race. Okay, so the argument now, so for most scientists, most researchers, for most people in academia, we're going to go ahead and argue that there is only one race, and that is the human race. And the argument is that there's not enough variation between us genetically to argue for different races. We are all the same race. We are all humans. That's it. There's no variation as far as races. So the idea here is that races is something that is socially constructed, okay? And the line for what constitutes or the characteristics for one race is constantly moving back and forth, okay? So the image that you will be looking at here is going to have some individuals. So the first individuals here is going to be Nordish, okay? The second would be, I can't even probably pronounce this incorrectly, Daenerys. The third would be Mediterranean. The fourth would be Alpinish. The fifth would be Ukrainish. So the sixth would be Turk. 7 would be Bedouin. And 8 would be Afghan. Okay? So these are groups of people. Based on Johann's 5 races, all of these individuals would be considered Caucasian or white. Okay? So now looking at these images today, would you consider somebody from Afghanistan or somebody who's Bedouin or somebody who's Turkish, would you consider them white? And this is a question that, I'll need you guys to, I just want you guys to think about it, right? For some of you today, you might not consider somebody who is, from Afghanistan white, or somebody who, is from Northern Africa white or Caucasian, okay? Mediterranean, it depends, right? Some people live in the Mediterranean, some people that live in, Spain, Greek, they might not consider themselves white. They might consider themselves something other than white. European, maybe they're going to go with nationalities. I'm just Italian, or who knows? Like I said, I know people that are, from Europe. I know people that are, Italian. They don't consider themselves white. They consider themselves to be Italian or something other than white. But based on Johann's, research, he's going to argue there's 5 races, and the first race, or the Caucasian or Caucasoid race, is made up of the individuals that are in this image. So Nordish, Daenerys, Mediterranean, Alpinish, Ukrainish, Turk, Bedouin, Afghan. These are all individuals who Johann who would consider Caucasian. Now today, I'd argue that most of these people here would not consider themselves to be Caucasian for the most part. Definitely, maybe the Bedouin or the Afghan, the Turk probably not. Maybe the individuals in the Mediterranean might not. It depends, right? It really depends. So, like I said, race is socially constructed, and the line that's going to determine what race you are is constantly being moved. All right. So I'm going to drive the point home here. Okay, so phrenology, physiognomy, I pronounce that wrong, always do. So these two practices, okay, I would consider them to be a pseudoscience. And a pseudoscience is a science that's essentially been debunked, okay, not real. Okay, we're not going to go ahead and argue that this is science, that this is true. We're going to argue that it has essentially been proven wrong, okay? So the first would be involved measuring facial and other body characteristics as indicative of human personality, okay? And then we have phrenology, attempted to determine intelligence and personality based on the size and shape of the skull, which is something that Johann did, right? So Johann was going to look at physical characteristics and argue that certain physical characteristics can essentially determine what group you belong to, okay? So for now, so here's a pretty good example of how you can use phrenology, physiognomy, in a way that's going to go ahead and essentially target particular groups of individuals as not just outsiders, but less than. So essentially what you're going to do is you're going to other, okay? So the image at the top here, right? Grades of intelligence, and this should pretty much says it all. Okay, so the first, profile there is somebody you would argue would be Caucasian. At least I would argue. So Caucasian, and then it just kind of runs down the line, right? Caucasian, maybe somebody who might be maybe, I'd not say maybe Mediterranean. So as it goes down further, you see the grades start to slide. And another important thing I didn't mention yet. It's horrible to say, but well, for phrenology, okay, so phrenology is a study of the skull, right? And essentially what happened was these individuals, these scientists, I didn't say individuals, but these individuals were scientists, they were studying the brain, studying grades of intelligence, and this was at its infancy, right, when we were looking at these kind of things. So pretty much what they argued, or what they came up with, and they're not mistaken in their assumption, but what they argue is that certain parts of the brain are responsible for certain functions. Okay, so the frontal lobe is going to be responsible for cognitive abilities. Okay, so this is something that they understood. Okay, primitive. If this research or this kind of study was in its infancy, but still, they knew enough to know that the frontal lobe, the front part of your brain, dealt with cognition. Okay, so what they were going to argue, this is where things start to get ugly. They're going to argue that if you have a particularly well-developed frontal lobe, your brain, then you should also particularly have a well-developed skull, forehead, right? So the idea is the image of the individual on the first image, the individual in the front, all right, of the grades of intelligence. You would argue that would be a Caucasian man. And if you look at his forehead, that's a particularly well-developed forehead, very flat, very pronounced forehead. And if you look at the images of the other individuals, the other races, right, is what they were going to argue, these other races of individuals, you start to see the forehead slowly but surely shrink, right, and start to slope, right? And that's what they're going to argue determines intelligence. So this was going to be, and if you believe this, right, like I said, if you were a researcher, if you were a scientist, and this is the information you put out, people would believe this, and they would believe that the individuals who do not have this particular profile, people that do not have this physical characteristic, right, of the skull shape, were inferior. They were feeble-minded. Okay, they were biological throwbacks. Okay, these people are not the same as us. These people are biologically inferior to us because, well, you can see. Look at the shape of their skull. Like I said, this is a much more primitive. They would argue a much more primitive version of mankind. And it's a horrible way to think about people. It really is. But like I said, if this is what was being presented to you, why wouldn't you believe it? Okay, and that's the danger with being presented information that's not true. Okay, and then if you look at the image on the bottom there, you have you know, and I find this just entertaining, right? These are the physical characteristics or features of a husband who would be genuine, and the physical characteristics, features of a husband who would be unreliable. Okay, so the exaggerated nose, the chin, the protruding chin, the shape of the skull. Look at the forehead, how it's not as pronounced as the genuine husband. So once again, like I said, you can look at those physical features or characteristics and come up with what that person is like. Which would be today would be ridiculous to even argue for. But some people might still do that. Okay. So social construction of race, guys, like I said, I'm hitting this really hard just because I think it's the most important part of this chapter. If you just understand that race is socially constructed, and there's reasons why certain groups of people are classified in the way they are, so that I'd argue, supports and benefits one group over another. Okay, so the sociological way of understanding racial categories, right? We've already kind of talked about this. It suggests that race is not biologically identifiable, and that previous racial categories were arbitrarily assigned based on pseudoscience and used to justify racist practices, right? This is what we just covered, right? The whole 5 races of individuals. And like I said, that changed too. I think it was like 4, and then it was 3, and they came up with a bunch of different ones. But what we're talking about would be the 5. That would be a pseudoscience, okay? And the idea is, I'm not sure if Johann necessarily himself was racist. Okay, I don't know if I can even use that term for Johann. I had to do more research, but the idea was that the information that he created, the research that he developed, the data that he developed, that he came up with, I argue would have been used to support racist practices, justify racist practices. Okay, so race can also be a system of labeling that provides a source of identity. So specific labels fall in and out of favor during different social eras, right? So, like, and the perfect example would be the 5 categories, or the 5 racial categories by Johann, right? For the most part, we don't use, American in the terms of, definitely today, Americans are not redskin, Indians or Native Americans. That's not the way we use it. Mongolians, a term we don't use anymore. Ethiopian is a term we don't use anymore to describe groups of people. Caucasian is one that we still use. Okay, so like I said, they fall in and out of favor. Okay, and the image on the bottom once again is going to be an example how we use these terms, these categories to essentially select people who will be essentially at the bottom and who will be at the top. All right, so we're going to go ahead and other, and the term would be othering. So we're going to go pick a particular group of people, and when we other them, we essentially justify and okay the mistreatment of that group. Okay, so the idea is we're going to go and other this particular group of people as less than, as savages, as subhuman, biological throwbacks, and then we've seen this time and time again. This was an argument that was used during slavery, right? So the idea was, this is just an example, right? When the push to end slavery was, gaining momentum, a lot of individuals who supported slavery argue that slaves were feeble-minded, slaves were incapable of taking care of themselves, and that, in fact, slaves were better off and happy being slaves. Okay, and the way they portrayed Africans that were slaves supported this, right? So an example would be men, right? So men were essentially characterized as almost childish, okay? Childish and incapable of taking care of themselves, okay? And then after slavery was abolished and there was a push for a new system to control Africans or newly freed slaves, which led to Jim Crow, the image, the way they portrayed African males changed. So it went from this this docile, feeble-minded, individual who can't fend for himself, to this image of the brute, this beast that was now a threat to essentially white Americans. Okay, so that's how they change. That's how race, not so much race, but just how images are used to support an agenda. Okay, so the image here at the bottom. Okay, to the left you have Irish Iberian, Anglo-Teutonic, and then Negro. Okay, so once again, take a look at that. Look at those profiles. Okay, based on what we've already talked about, what would you argue? Okay, look at the skull shapes. Like, those profiles are severely exaggerated for a reason. Okay, and they're exaggerated for a reason because they want the reader to understand that Anglo-Teutonic would be the most developed version, or the most developed category of mankind. So this would be the most developed. Let's just say that most developed race. So this would be the most developed race. It would be the Anglo. Okay, this is the pinnacle of evolution here. Okay, and then to the left you have Irish. Okay, so this individual does have a very, actually quite, why does a very protruding chin, right? So the mouth features are all protruding. Look at the forehead, sloped back, poorly formed. So what's that going to tell you? So the argument is, if Irish people, this is what Irish people look like. They are not as developed as Anglos. So this would probably be British, right? Let's be honest. So British is probably the individual in the middle will be a representation of a British individual, I would argue, because they're using Irish. And Britain, England pretty much, conquered and ruled Ireland for, I don't know, like 700 years or something like that, something ridiculous. So hundreds of years, they subjugated Ireland. So people in Ireland were viewed as less than. Okay, and then you have, to the very far right, African. So look at the Africans, same thing, protruding chin. I'd argue probably just a little bit more protruding than the Irish, but not by much. The forehead is probably, not as well formed as the Irish, but not far off. So what is this image telling us? This image is telling us that the Anglo would be the superior race compared to Irish and Negro, right? Or African, okay? Today we wouldn't go by this, right? I mean, I'd argue today, we people that are Irish or Scottish, would just be considered white, okay? So, and then people that are African, well, still are being targeted for, mistreatment, okay? So like I said, race is socially constructed. And this supported, the idea that you're going to go ahead and classify Irish as, biological throwbacks and Africans as biological throwbacks, essentially supports a system where you're going to go ahead and colonize, you're going to invade, you're going to colonize, and you're going to exploit. You're going to take advantage of the resources that the people in these countries have. Like I said, Ireland, Scotland, essentially existed under British rule for hundreds of years. Africa colonized. India colonized. So the UK, the Brits were pretty good at colonizing. Actually, they were probably one of the best at it. And when you colonize a group of people, you're essentially invading them and taking over and exploiting the resources. And it's much easier to exploit these resources if you can justify this practice by arguing that these people are biological throwbacks, that they're inferior to you. The idea that these people are actually going to benefit from you being there and colonizing them, right? That they're going to essentially rise up to some extent, a little bit, based on the fact that you're there as, they're essentially their overlord, for lack of a better term, right? And you can see this is something we've seen here in, California with the missions, right? You have the Spanish missions. If you think about them, and like I said, I love the Spanish missions. Beautiful. If you've not been to the missions in Capistrano or the missions in California, you should go take a look at them because they are actually pretty amazing. But when you think about what they were and what they did, it's kind of disturbing. It's kind of troubling, right? So the missions sound kind of strong. What was the point of the missions? The missions were part of the responsibility of the job of the mission was to convert, right? You're going to go ahead and convert the natives in that area. And I argued that a lot of that converting wasn't done in such a way we would consider to be beneficial or humane. Right? Native American people were forced to cut their hair, forced to, wear, clothing that they did not want to wear, stop speaking their native language. They were forced to be removed from lands. So, like I said, the missionary work was part of this whole colonization effort, okay, within, the California and really, the majority of the country. Okay, so just an example. All right. So what is ethnicity? So ethnicity essentially describes a shared culture, practices, values, beliefs of a group, right? And we've talked about this, right? We talked about what culture is, really. And when we think about what culture is, that's really what your ethnicity is, right? So shared language, religion, traditions, among other commonalities, right? Also a very fluid concept, right? Individuals may be identified or self-identified with ethnicities in complex and even contradictory ways. So an example would be ethnic groups such as Irish, Italian American, Russians, people that are Jewish, Serbian might all be groupings whose members are predominantly included in what they consider to be a white racial category. Okay, and like I said, ethnicity is something it changes quite a bit. Okay, so I'm going to show you an example how ethnicity or culture is something that might not be as solid or might not be as solid as you think it is.
Growing up, we were German. We danced in a German dance group. I wore lederhosen. When I first got on Ancestry, I was really surprised that I wasn't finding all of these Germans in my tree. I decided to have my DNA tested through Ancestry DNA. The big surprise was we're not German at all. 52% of my DNA comes from Scotland and Ireland. So I traded in my lederhosen for a kilt.
Ancestry has many paths to discovering your story. Get started for free at Ancestry.com.
Okay, so after we just watched that short little clip of the gentleman for Ancestry.com who lived his entire life thinking culturally he was German. Okay, now, not to pick on him, but kind of to pick on him, when I look at that guy, what I see is Costco. Like, that's what I see when I see that guy in that commercial, that Ancestry.com commercial. I see, like, the Costco jeans, for like $15. I see the Costco sweater, the Costco, like, the Calvin Klein, like, button up for like $15, $20. Like, that guy looks like he shops at Costco. Like, there's nothing about him that's, what you consider, culturally defining, right? I mean, think about it. There's nothing about him that you would argue identifies as anything other than what? American? Right, like I said, Costco, right? Like, I don't know. He's just kind of just bland looking, right? But then there's, that part of where he's jumped around in his lederhosen, right? Where he culturally identifies as German. Really? German? Okay. And then he ran his little Ancestry, went to Ancestry.com, ran his DNA, and then, lo and behold, he was Scottish and Irish, so he's going to go ahead and trade in his, lederhosen for a kilt, right? So, yeah. I don't know what to think about this. What do you guys think about it, right? How is he able to jump back and forth from those, right? Think about it. How many people are able to do that? How many people are able to go ahead and say that, I was German my entire life, and guess what? Ran my DNA and found out that I was Italian or Spanish or whatever it may be, right? And I get to culturally be that for a little bit, when I want to have fun, when it's Oktoberfest where I can claim my German ancestry. And then, when it's not Oktoberfest anymore, then I just go back to being, Costco, whatever that is, whatever he claims to be, right? Culturally. Well, culture, we'll just say he's American, right? So not a lot of people get to do that, right? I mean, it's strange. It's a strange idea for me. I don't know. Maybe we'll go ahead and do a discussion board post on that where we talk about, this guy and what he's able to do and not do. Okay, but that's a good example, at least in my opinion, of what ethnicity is, right? In a very comical and probably very privileged way. All right, moving on. Minority groups. Okay, so minority groups is a term that, for the most part, argues for some type of discrimination, right? So essentially, if you're a part of a minority group, then you're a part of the group that does not have power in the society that you are a part of, right? So that's the big thing. That's the huge characteristic, the identifier. If you lack power in your society, you're probably part of a minority group, okay? And the dominant group is the group in the society that essentially has power. And we know what power is, right? Power is the ability to control your life and the lives of others. So if you're part of the group who has the ability to control its own lives and the lives of others, you are in the dominant group, okay? And this has nothing to do with numbers, okay? You can be numerically larger as a group, but as long as you lack power, you're still the minority. And the dominant group could be numerically much smaller, but if that smaller dominant group numerically has power and controls through various different means, politics, money, all those things, then they are the dominant group. Okay? Like I said, we talked about what lack of power is. So, actually, we just did cover this, actually. So being a numerical minority is not a characteristic of a minority group. So let's just go ahead and, make that clear. Like I said, you can have the numbers. You can be the largest minority group in the country, but if you don't have the power to control your own lives and the lives of others, then you are not in the majority. You are not the dominant group, okay? So, Wagley and Harris, 1958, decided to come up with some characteristics, or essentially like a little checklist, right? A checklist to determine whether or not you are are part of a minority group. So the first characteristic or qualifier, right, would be unequal treatment and less power over your life, or over their lives, right? So our lives, depending on if you're part of a minority group. So if you have unequal treatment or have experienced unequal treatment and less power over your life, you may be in a minority, all right? 2, distinguishing physical or cultural traits like skin color or language. Okay, so if you have a particular skin color or speak a particular language or are part of a particular religious group, okay, you may be a minority. Involuntary membership in the group. Well, that pretty much means that you were born into it, right? You have no choice, right? Your birth lottery, you didn't hit the birth lottery. Let's put it that way, right? Awareness of subordination. Now, if you are part of a minority group, subordinate group, I'd argue if you haven't experienced it, or if you don't know by now, one day you will eventually, right? You might not be aware of your subordinate status, okay? It can be one of those ideas where you don't realize the position that you're in because you've kind of lived that in your entire life, and you just don't realize it until you kind of step outside the world or the bubble that you live in, your subordinate little bubble world, and then you realize there's a whole world of things out there that you don't have access to, and then you realize you are a part of a minority group. And then high rate of in-group marriage. Okay, so pretty much this means that minority groups are going to tend to marry essentially other people within that same group, right? And this is, even though it was done in 1950, I argue this still holds true, right? I like this concept. I like theories and concepts like this, right? That that you can argue back and forth about. There's some depth to this, right? So unequal treatment and less power over their lives, right? So ask yourself, do you have that? Have you been treated unfairly or unequally, right? Do you have less power over your life than other people do, right? Think about that. What power do you have over your own life right now? Okay, you can control certain things, right? But how much control do you have, right? You want to buy a house, you want to go to school. I mean, when we first did the student introductions, right, we talked about this. What kind of lives do you want for yourselves, right? And think about it. Most of us were fighting, I'd argue, for a middle-class life if we don't have one, and to stay in a middle-class life if you have one. But I think most of us were struggling to get into the middle class, right? Well, think about it, right? If you're part of the dominant group, right, an affluent group within our society, you're already in the middle class, right? So you're probably not even arguing that you want to, like you're not even aware of your status, right? That's unequal. I mean, the idea that, when certain people take for granted, we don't even have as members of a minority group, right? Access to certain resources would be an example, like education or quality education. We'll just go put it that, right? Because everybody has access to education in K through 12, but all education is not created equal, right? So if you're part of a minority group, you might have access to education, but the education system you might have access to is just happy if they can get you out of there with a diploma. Okay, they're not looking to push you and groom you and prep you for a graduation that leads you into a college, right? That's not the goal. So that's unequal treatment or unfair access to resources, and that in turn leads to less power, over your lives. Because essentially the idea is that when you go to these universities, prestigious universities in particular, Ivy League universities, is really what I'm talking about. The connections that you have, the people that you're surrounded with, are just as valuable, if not more valuable, than the actual curriculum or the education that you receive. I'd argue, because you do network with people who can, essentially make or break you. Okay, I have friends that have graduated from pretty prestigious universities, and the alumni alone is amazing, is worth it. Okay. Number 2, distinguishing physical or cultural traits like skin color or language. So, what does this mean? Well, pretty simple, right? What's the color of my skin? If I'm black, if I am Latino, Hispanic, Asian, if I have some kind of physical characteristic that I can't hide, right? Like the little video, right, that we just had you guys watch about the guy in Answers.com, right? Cultural traits, like those things, like he could hide those. Like he was German his whole life, right? He could hide his little lederhosen. He could hide his kilt. He can hide all those things, right? Okay. If you have a physical characteristic that you were born with that connects you to a subordinate or a minority group, that's it. That's you can't do much about that, right? And there's cases that there's been, well, actually right now what I've seen a lot of, maybe we'll do a video on that, would be skin creams, whitening skin creams in India, and they're pretty rampant. So they use, essentially what that is there's people within India who take these skin creams that essentially bleach their skin, and I heard it's not very comfortable and it's probably not good for you. But the idea is they're going to bleach their skin. They're going to do that so they appear more fair, and because they have fair skin, then they'll be treated differently. Okay, so they're going to go ahead and try to disguise their physical or cultural traits that connect them to a minority group. Okay, this is the way I see it. The involuntary membership into the group. Well, this is like I said. You were born into a family that was, a black family, Hispanic family, an Asian family, any family that would be considered would have minority status. If you're born into that family, then there's nothing you can do about that, right? Membership is essentially given at birth. Okay. And then there's awareness of subordination, right? So the idea is that you may realize, or you may not, that being a member of a minority group, you are essentially part of what would be considered a subordinate group, right? So subordination means that you're going to not have access to the same resources. You are subordinate in the sense that you don't have the same powers or rights as other groups within society. Okay, so an example of this would be what we've been seeing. Okay, over the last couple of weeks, like almost about a month and a half, 2 months now, right? One of the biggest arguments from Black Lives Matter is the way that people that are black or Hispanic or brown, essentially people that are minority, particularly black, way they're treated by law enforcement, right? So the idea is that law enforcement is going to see somebody who is black, and there's no benefit of the doubt, right? The idea is that these individuals are almost inherently criminal, deviant in some way, shape, or form, and they're going to be treated as such, right? And there's research out there that'll back this up. Like I said, I can spend a whole hour, if not more, talking just about this. But there's plenty of research out there that's going to go ahead and argue and show that young black males are viewed as threats. So people will see young black males, teenagers, kids, as threats over white males. So young white males. So essentially the difference between the two is that they're viewed as, well, we'll just go quote, Hillary Clinton in the, super predators. You guys remember that when Hillary Clinton used the term super predators it was the 90s when the Clintons were getting tough on crime, 3 strikes laws and stop and frisk things and God knows what else they were doing. But Hillary Clinton said this. Hillary Clinton used the term super predators to describe minority males, black and Hispanic, but particularly black males. She called them super predators. And I remember when she was running for president, this came back to bite her, and bite her big time. Okay? So that's going to be, and at least in my opinion, example, of awareness of subordination, right? When you are part of a minority group that's been labeled, by the First Lady, that's been labeled by the President, that's been labeled by the federal government as super predators, right? That's a tough thing to shake off. So 5, high rate of in-group marriage. Well, really, what this is arguing is that people that are born in, or essentially have minority group status, essentially lack resources, and there's a lot that goes along with this. Okay, but the way I think about it, the way I look at it is, you think of minority groups. So you think of minority groups, large minority groups. Let's look at like Santa Ana, right? Let's take Santa Ana example. Let's look at just maybe Orange County, right? So in Orange County, you have a large communities that would be considered minority groups, right? You have Santa Ana, you have Little Saigon, just an example, right? Then if you go to Long Beach area, you have Cambodia town, so you have pockets, right? These ethnic enclaves. So let's just say Santa Ana, right? So Santa Ana is an ethnic enclave, okay, predominantly Hispanic, Latino, whatever term you want to use, right? Because this group of individuals or within this community lack resources, so let's just say access to education, access to let's just say lack access to education. Let's just use that, right, as a scenario. So you lack access to education. Therefore, then when you graduate from high school, you're probably going to stick around here, right? You're not going to go out of state or even move, to a different part of the state, or so it's not like you're going to get out of here and move to the East Coast or different parts of the country where you're going to experience and have access to other people. And that's really what I'm kind of getting to. Okay, so high rate of in-group marriage is going to argue that people within minority groups tend to stick around or tend to live the entirety of their lives with people within that same minority group. So if you live your whole life, or if you think about it, if you're in your late teens, early 20s, and you're dating, and you don't travel outside the area that you grew up in, which is an ethnic enclave, then why would you marry somebody? How could you marry somebody who is different from you, culturally, ethnically? Okay, you wouldn't have access to those individuals. Now, if you grew up in Santa Ana and then you went to college somewhere else, maybe on the East Coast or even someplace else in the, even just say go as far as LA. Like even if you went to USC or UCLA, or if you went to the Bay Area, like you're going to be exposed to all the demographics are going to change considerably, right? And that definitely improves your odds of meeting somebody and marrying somebody from a different group, different minority group, or just different group, period. Okay, so like I said, even though it was 1958, Wagley, Harris, I do agree with a lot of these, right? And like I said, I like them because we can talk about them, whether or not they make sense, whether or not they don't, okay? All right, let's move forward. All right, so another concept, scapegoat theory. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think it's there's not too much to it, right, really. Okay, so scapegoat theory is just going to suggest that a dominant group, so the group of power, will displace its unfocused aggression onto a subordinate group. So the example of this would be, Adolf Hitler, right? The Nazis essentially targeting, the Jewish population for, essentially extermination, right? They blamed them for the problems that Germany was having. So we're going to blame somebody, right? We're going to find somebody to take the fall for this, okay? And we do this all the time, okay? In the United States, immigrants have usually been the easiest targets for this, for scapegoating, okay? The two individuals on the bottom here would be two, and if you look at these individuals, right? Maybe I'll just ask you this. Looking at this image here, you see these two guys, right? Sitting down. Ethnically, racially, what would you consider them to be? So if I saw these guys today sitting down, what would you consider them to be, right? Would they be Caucasian, white? Would they be something else? It's up to you to determine, right? Looking at these guys today, I'd argue, right? Like I said, if we were in class, we could go back and forth about this right now, but unfortunately we're not face to face. But I'd argue, looking at these two individuals, I would just say they were Caucasian. I'm not exactly sure what Caucasian, right? But Caucasian nonetheless. Right, these two individuals were Italian. These were Italian immigrants who were arrested. So essentially what they were arrested for was a murder. Okay, there was a murder, and they wanted two people to take a fall for this. So they targeted, Italian immigrant population. They arrested these two individuals and found them guilty, and I believe they were both executed. Okay, so like I said, race and what it is and what it isn't is constantly shifting. It's a very fluid concept. Okay, so today these individuals would be considered just white, I'd argue. Back then we're considered Italians, or they were Italians, but they consider it as a minority group or as less than. Okay. All right, and these laws are popular because they let the dominant group scapegoat a subordinate group, right? And like I said, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but we've seen this time and time again. In the 1970s, a lot of car manufacturing plants, GM, Ford, the big three, was it Ford, Chevy, and then Chrysler. They were having a tough time selling cars in the United States because they were getting a lot of competition from Japan. Because Japan was, making a killing with their vehicles, right? So a lot of auto workers were losing their jobs because, they were shipping manufacturing jobs to other countries, things like that. So GM, the three auto manufacturers were getting hit really hard. And instead of people getting mad at the auto manufacturers for, literally, outsourcing, manufacturing, what they did is they got mad essentially at Japan, right? That's going to be your scapegoat. Okay, and there was a case of a couple individuals at a bar drinking, and there were auto workers, I believe, who were laid off or about to get laid off. They were drunk at a bar, and they see a man walk in or see another man at the bar, and the man is Asian. Okay, and for them that was good enough. He was Asian, he must be Japanese. We're angry at Japanese people right now because of what's happening. We're losing our jobs because of them. So they essentially assault this man, and as a result of that assault, the man died. Okay, and it turns out that the man wasn't even Japanese, he was Chinese. Okay, but like I said, that's a scapegoat. We're upset, we're losing our jobs, we're losing our American automotive manufacturing jobs, and the reason why is because we're getting all this competition. We're losing, out to all these Japanese auto manufacturers that are coming in and essentially, outselling us. So we're going to go ahead and attack this individual at the bar who we presume to be Japanese, but wasn't. And in any case, it wouldn't matter. It's still scapegoat. Okay, people are constantly doing this. All right, so now we're going to talk about stereotypes. Stereotypes are probably one of my favorite things to talk about. Stereotypes are horrible. Absolutely horrible. But the reason why I like talking about them is because I'd argue that most people, most honest people, would admit to at least one point in their lives using or believing a stereotype. So ask yourselves, what stereotypes are you guilty of using or believing in, right? So let's go over what stereotypes are. So stereotypes are oversimplified generalizations about groups of people. Okay, simple enough, right? And that's really what it is. It's just a generalization. Can be based off of race, ethnicity, age, gender, sexual orientation, and almost any characteristics you can think of. They are positive and negative. Now, careful with this though. They are positive and negative as far as their assertions, but stereotypes, in my opinion, and I'd argue most people's opinions, definitely this author's, is that whether they're positive or negative, they're still always wrong, or they have there's a negative outcome to them, right? And I'll go into what this means in a little bit, okay? And generalization doesn't take individual differences into account, okay? So now that we have this little rundown of what stereotypes are, let's talk about them, okay? So oversimplified generalization about groups of people. So we have those, okay? So like I said, if we're in class right now, I'd ask you guys to share with me, for those of you who'd be willing to share with me some stereotypes that, you know, you've heard growing up that, you know, you may not admit to using yourselves, but people around you haven't, you know, used. I'd argue that most people have relatives that use pretty horrible stereotypes about people. I know I do. I don't know about you. My grandma was pretty bad. Okay, so Time Magazine. Take a look at this image here. Those Asian American whiz kids. Okay, so what is this arguing? What is this? This is arguing for a stereotype, right? And the stereotype is that Asian American kids are what? Or that they excel exceptionally academically. So when it comes to academics, Asian kids excel. Okay, this leads this kind of stereotype. So Asian Americans or Asian American kids excel academically, right? So this takes us down to there are positive and negative stereotypes. So some people would argue that this is a positive stereotype, right? What's wrong with the stereotype that argues that, you know, Asian kids are academically gifted? All of them. You know, every single one of them, right? Because that's what a stereotype is, right? It's a generalization of a group of people, right? So the generalization is that Asians or Asian American kids or Asian kids are gifted academically. All of them. This is a positive stereotype. So what's the problem with this? What's the problem with having this stereotype? Okay, and the problem with the stereotype is that not all Asian kids are academically gifted, right? And then you got to think about, too, this is another important thing. What is Asian? Okay, so Asian what? Because that's a pretty broad brush to paint an entire group with, right? Because there's people within this country that are from, you know, let's just take a look at this, right? Resources. So let's look at resources you have and do not have. So let's just say within Southern California, right, we have a very large Vietnamese population, actually probably the largest Vietnamese population outside of Vietnam. We have in Long Beach probably the largest population of Cambodians outside of Cambodia, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so we'll look at this population and argue how did they come to the United States? This is very important. How you come here is going to determine how well you do. So I argue that people that are Vietnamese, not argue, this is true, they're here as refugees. Cambodians are here as refugees. I have a lot of friends that are Cambodian and Vietnamese whose families came here in the late 1970s for Vietnam and then in the 1980s for my Cambodian friends. Okay, so the idea is when they came here with very little or next to nothing. Okay, so their resources they had access to were limited, so it made it very difficult for them, you know, to not only just to, I'm not going to say just assimilate, but to do well, right? So let's say you came from another country, right? I also have friends that are from Korea, okay, South Korea, and when they came over here as young adults, and they came over here with master's degrees. They came over here because they worked for companies that essentially sponsored their visas, and they came over here with the visa to work, already educated. And my friends that are from Korea that already spoke English, they were learning. Okay, so when they came here, their English was, I'd say, conversational, right? You could have a conversation with them, right? But there was a lot of back and forth as far as meaning, hesitation, things like that. After 2 years, English, I'd say more than proficient. Okay, but they weren't just like taking night classes, right, at the community college. Like they were in like almost like accelerated programs where they were learning how to speak English. Okay, and all these things cost money. Okay, so Asian American whiz kids. So the idea is that you can't say Asian and apply it to every single person who would fall under the category of Asian as being gifted. Okay, there's going to be a lot to it, and the whole little scenario, the whole thing I just went on right now was about how different groups of people from different parts of the world would be considered Asian come here, and they come here with different resources, right? And it's the same thing with the Latin population, or Hispanic population, whatever term you want to use, right? Cubans, the Cuban population that we have here has done much better than a lot of other populations of individuals from Latin America. And the reason for that is that when Fidel Castro came in, overthrew the government that was there, the people that were refugees that we took into the United States were individuals who were from the middle class. These are individuals who were educated, affluent individuals who were brought over here to the United States, and they resettled in the United States, but they resettled here with resources. So if you resettle with resources, you're going to do much better than individuals who come here with very little resources or next to nothing. Okay, and that's why I argue that even though the stereotype that Asian American kids are whiz kids, even though it may seem on its face to be a positive thing, is negative, right? And it's negative because it doesn't take into account the various experiences that these different groups have. And you can't do that. You essentially you're invalidating the experiences of individuals from Vietnam, Cambodia, Southeast Asia. Like you can't lump everybody into one group. Okay. Right. So I hope that makes sense. So moving forward, where do stereotypes come from? Ugh. All right. Well, stereotypes are there's rarely any new stereotypes for the most part. Most stereotypes that we use are going to be stereotypes that were essentially recycled. So essentially the idea is that one group of individuals were the victims of the particular stereotype, and then once those individuals assimilate, gain some status, they'll use that stereotype for another group of individuals who has less than them, or access to less resources or less power, okay, within a society. And a horrible example of this. And that's why I miss being in class face-to-face. Not that you guys still can't share things with me, but it's difficult. So I asked a student, it must have been about a year or two ago, to share with me some stereotypes that their families have. Okay, and one student told me that their grandma refers to, and now, so mind you, this student is Hispanic. Their grandparents immigrated here. So their grandparents immigrated here. Okay, so I believe this student might be probably second generation, okay, American, but their grandparents immigrated here. Okay, so that's who the student is and who their grandparent is, okay? So the student told me that their grandparent calls newly arrived immigrants from Mexico and essentially, Latin American, so Latin American countries. We'll just say Mexico. So newly arrived immigrants from Mexico, and forgive me if I mispronounce this, tacuaches, Okay, this wasn't a term that I was familiar with. It wasn't a term I was familiar with as a derogatory or had a negative connotation for me, right? So, for those of you who don't know, the guachas is possum. This student told me that their grandparents referred to newly arrived immigrants as possums. I wasn't familiar with this. And I asked the student to ask their grandparent why they did that. And they did. Next time I saw the student, they told me that their grandparent told them that that their grandparents said, this is what their grandparents said, that they do not like newly arrived immigrants from Mexico because they remind them of possums. Because they creep around at night, they're ugly, they're rodents, they're a nuisance, and just pretty much all the horrible things that you would try to equate to a possum. And possums aren't even that. Like possums don't bother nobody, you know. So there's a whole nother aside there, right? I don't like the fact that they don't like possums. But this grandparent was going to go ahead and essentially, from a position, right, from a position of status, right, because this grandparent's been here for quite some time now, and forgets that they were at one point in their lives that newly arrived immigrant. So that newly arrived immigrant that their grandparent was, they probably faced some kind of discrimination. They were probably called similar things. My relatives have been called horrible things, right? So that grandparent experienced all this, and then given 20, 30, 40 years of assimilation and of gaining resources and status within this country, is now in position of status over newly arrived individuals from that country. And now with that new position, that new status, they choose to do what? They choose to stereotype and generalize somebody who's in the position they once were themselves. So like I said, new stereotypes are rarely created. More often than not, they're simply recycled. Okay, now there's a film that deals with race and relations, things like that, that you might be familiar with. Something you could use to, this example would be that movie Gangs of New York, right? So Gangs of New York deals with one group of individuals who consider themselves Native Americans, and these are people that are immigrants themselves who are upset with the large influx of other immigrants coming in from Europe. Okay, and that's kind of what the movie's based on. It's about a particular part of New York where there's essentially fighting over a lack of resources. So this one group that consider themselves Native Americans, which essentially they're newly arrived, they're immigrants from Europe who are just more established than the other immigrants coming in. Okay, and the image I have here just as another example of how minority groups are essentially lumped together. This is a very old image, but essentially you have a black individual and an Irish individual who are depicted, I would consider a very in a very offensive way, very exaggerated features. Okay, both of them. In no way, shape, or form does this represent any of these two groups, either of these groups, but that's what these images do, right? So pretty much what this image is trying to convey, the message is trying to convey, is that black people and Irish people are the same. Socially, so essentially they're both biological throwbacks. They're both savages. That's pretty much what this image is going to go ahead and argue for. All right. So prejudice. I'm going to spend too much time on this. So prejudice refers to unjustified or incorrect beliefs, thoughts, feelings, and attitudes towards someone, or that someone holds about another group, right? So this can be a stereotype, so it can be any of those things, right? So if I believe that, and like I said, stereotypes aren't just based on race. They can be based on anything, okay? Like in class when I asked you, normally what I would do is ask you guys to come up with some stereotypes that you've heard, right? And everybody kind of gets quiet and says, there's stereotypes about driving, right? And but about particular groups being bad drivers, right? And one student said first, I thought this was awesome. The first student said flat out that women are bad drivers, right? That's a stereotype, that women are bad drivers. When some people are going to go ahead and, accuse another minority group of being bad drivers. But this student's like, no, women are bad drivers, right? And she was right. That's a stereotype that she heard, that as a woman, she was a bad driver. But the reality is, women are better drivers than men. And there's actually proof for that, right? Because insurance, women pay less for insurance than men do, especially young men. Men in their late teens to early, through their 20s, pay more for insurance than women do because men are more reckless, which means they're worse drivers than women. Men will take more risks than women, which makes them a liability, which means they'll have to pay more for insurance. So, but that's a stereotype, right? That some people believe in, that women are, worse drivers than men. Okay, so like I said, stereotype could be on race, it could be on religion, it could be on gender, it could be age, it could be any of those things. Okay, but prejudice is believing in those stereotypes. So if you believe in those stereotypes, that makes you prejudiced, right? Or leads to prejudice, right? It's based on, and the thing is, prejudice is usually not based on a personal experience, right? It's something that we're taught. So if you grew up in a family that was particularly racist or had particular views that weren't kind towards other groups, you're going to go ahead and hold those same beliefs. Not because you've had any kind of personal experience with another group, but because this is what you were taught, right? My grandma said this. My grandpa said that. I was raised to believe that these people were bad people and these people were not bad people. And I've had students tell me this. I've had one student tell me that when she remembers as a little kid, and I couldn't believe she shared this with me in class, in front of all the other students, and I think it was amazing that she did that, okay? She told me that she remembers as a little kid, her grandma, she says they were at a park, and she said they were playing, and she says she remembers her grandma pointing out some black kids, same age as her, and her grandma pointing them out and telling her not to play with them because they were ugly and they were scary. That's what her grandma told her. And I looked at her, I'm thinking, I was stunned. I'm in the middle of the class during a lecture, and she drops this on me. I'm thinking, like, I can't believe your grandma told that to you, and that's what you were taught. And she said, yeah, because that's what I was taught. I'm like, well, thank you for sharing. I go, thank you for putting your grandma on blast. Like, that's one hell of a thing to admit about your family. And then, of course, I couldn't just leave it there. So I asked her, like, so do you still talk to your grandma? She's like, nope, haven't talked to her in years. I'm like, because of that? She's like, because of that. I'm like, okay. She's like, I can't deal with that. She goes, like, I will not deal with that. As a kid, I had to, she said, but as an adult, I will not. And, that's impressive, right? To think that she will actually not, associate with her grandma because of those kind of beliefs, right? But like I said, it's not something that she experienced on her own, right? She didn't experience, black kids being horrible or mean or ugly or any of those things, but that was something that was taught to her. That was something that she was socialized to believe that that's what that group is, okay? So prejudice is something that's very rarely based on, I'd argue. I'd say never, because I don't like saying never. But I say rarely based on personal experience. It's something that's taught. Okay? And discrimination essentially consists of actions against a group of people. Essentially what this is if I'm an individual who has prejudicial views on a particular group, okay, I can hold those views, right? But the moment I treat somebody differently because of those views, then I'm now discriminating against that person, right? So essentially the idea is I might not like a particular group of individuals, but I'm not gonna actively treat them differently, or I'm not gonna treat them differently because of that. But let's say I don't hire somebody because of their race, or because of their gender, or because of their age, or because of whatever it is, because whatever that may be. Now I'm discriminating against them, right? And we have age discrimination, gender discrimination, we have all kinds of discrimination, right? So that's what that is. All right. So now we're going to talk about white privilege, which is something I'm sure you guys have all heard of by now. And I'd argue that the concept of white privilege, I don't know, it depends on how you want to classify it. Well, I'd argue it's a fairly new concept. I don't think the concept itself, I don't think it's been around longer than maybe 30 or 40 years, maybe, right? But it is something right now that is, it's a hot button topic, right? a lot of people are going to get really worked up when it comes to the concept of white privilege, right? And I'd argue it's a difficult thing to talk about, right? This is a difficult thing for me to talk about in class. I prefer to talk about it face to face, right? That way I can answer questions, go over things, right? And that way we can have a good back and forth. But it's difficult to have that here, so it's fine. But we'll go over what it is, okay, and what it isn't, because that's also very important, right? So white privilege, the definition, would be the inherent advantages possessed by a person, or white person, based on their race in a society characterized by racial inequality and injustice. So what does this mean, right? So what this is going to mean, this is the way I see it, right? This is the way, my interpretation of what this is going to argue that there would be certain advantages that are inherent to somebody who is or can be classified as a member of the dominant group. Okay, so let's look at it that way. So if you have dominant group and you have subordinate group. Okay, so whatever characteristics, physical or otherwise, that classify you as a member or that identify you as a member of the dominant group, you will have certain privileges over individuals who are in the subordinate group. Okay, so that's my interpretation of this, right? So when I see that, that's what it means to me, right? So a white person, like I said, and what is a white person, right? Because we've talked about this now for quite a bit. What is classified as white will change, right? Because race in itself is a concept that's very fluid and it will change. So what's white? What was considered a white person, 100 years ago, 200 years ago? White wasn't even used as a concept back then, but what it's been considered, it does change. I mean, let's look at it this way. Mexican people used to be considered white people, up to a certain point in time, and then it changed, right? Whether it be honorary white or white, they were considered white until it was no longer beneficial to consider them white people, and then we're going to change that classification so we can, take land or do this or do that, whatever it is we want to do to them, right? So, what white privilege for me is essentially membership into the dominant group, okay? And when you have membership into the dominant group, that means you benefit from that membership in the sense that you have access to, I want to say resources, because I want to say resources, but I feel like it's not the best word. We'll just go with resources for now, right? We'll just stick with that. So the inherent advantages possessed by a white person based on their race in a society characterized by racial inequality and injustice. So in the system we have today, the world that we live in today, it was built by the institutions that we have. They were all built by individuals who would be considered or classified as white. Okay, so since the system was built by individuals that were white, it benefits them, right? They are the dominant group. They have been the dominant group, and they've built a system that benefits them. Okay, so the idea is that the system, the institutions that we live under today, benefit individuals who are classified or can be classified as white. Okay, so that is the privilege that you have, right? That's the argument for this, right? So let's go over what white privilege is not. Because this is a difficult thing to talk about, right? Because there's going to be a lot of individuals who are classified as white or can be classified as white who aren't privileged. Actually, some of the poorest Americans that we have within this country are white, okay? And they are poor, and poor in a way that us in Southern California can't even imagine, okay? Like, we can't even fathom how some of these people live, But let's just kind of go over this, right? So what white privilege is not. So white privilege is not the suggestion that white people have never struggled, okay? So the argument is that, some people will say that, white people do not have to struggle for things. That is not correct. White people do have to struggle for things, okay? So white privilege is not a suggestion that white people have never have to struggle, are not struggling now, and won't need to struggle in the future, okay? So that's not what it's saying. Many white people do not enjoy the privileges that come with relative affluence, and this is true. Like I said, the majority of poor people in the United States, I'd argue, are white, okay? So there you go. Many white people do not enjoy these privileges. Okay, they don't enjoy access to Ivy League schools and access to homes and access to essentially a middle class life. They're working class or poor. And white privilege is not the assumption that everything a white person has accomplished is unearned. Like I said, no way, shape, or form is an argument that people that are white aren't going to struggle, haven't struggled, aren't struggling now, and won't continue to struggle to maintain status within our society, middle class, to earn a living and to prosper. Right? It's not saying that. Okay, and it's not the assumption that everything a white person has accomplished is unearned, because that's another, I say, fallacy, right? The idea that, well, you have that simply because you're white, and it's not true. Okay, so those are things that white privilege is not. And what white privilege is, the argument is that white privilege should be viewed as a built-in advantage. Now that this built-in advantage is going to be separate from your level of income and effort. Okay, so what is that? What does that mean, though, right? So if I still have to struggle, if I still, where does the privilege come in, right? And the privilege is going to come in at a level that's almost, I don't want to say abstract, but it's almost like an abstract concept, at least for me anyways, when I think about it, right? Because where is the privilege, right? If you still have to struggle, if you still have to do all these things, okay? But they're going to argue the white privilege is a built-in advantage. And what they're arguing is that it's a built-in advantage because you still have, even though you're poor, even though you're working hard, even though you don't have a lot of the things you would like or want or need, you still have privilege because you could be classified and as far as characterization as a member of the dominant group. Okay, so what is this? Right, it's so confusing, right? What does this mean, though? What's an example of this, right? So the example of this would be something along the lines of not being excluded from things in society simply based on the fact that you're white. Might be an example, right? So the idea is that maybe you were looking to buy a home or rent an apartment. So let's say you're looking to rent an apartment, right? Because that was one that came up recently in the last couple of years as far as discrimination, right? So say you're looking to rent an apartment, right? You make great money, you've had your job for years, you have great references, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to rent this apartment, okay? Now you show up to rent this apartment and you're black, right? As a person applying for this apartment, and you don't get it simply because you're black. That would be discrimination, racism, right? If you do get the apartment over simply because you're white, that would be some kind of privilege that's given towards you, right? So if you look at a person who's black and a person who's white, they have the same qualifications, the same income, the same, FICO score. So if you look at these people on paper, they look identical, right? The two people applying for the same apartment, okay? But the preference is going to be towards a white person simply because they're white. So the argument for white privilege is it's an advantage that is given to you in addition to your income and the amount of effort you put in, okay? So that's one example. Another example, would be profiling by law enforcement, right? So the idea is, you could be a poor black person or a poor white person, and the argument is that more often than not, you're going to be pulled over and stopped and questioned by police if you're black or if you're a minority, as opposed to not being viewed as a threat or as somebody who's a criminal if you're white, right? And that kind of goes back to the whole idea of the concept, like I told you before, about like Hillary Clinton. And it's not just Hillary. I'm not picking on Democrats. I'm not picking on Republicans. I'm not even going to go down that rabbit hole. I'm just saying, in the 1990s, there was a big push to get tough on crime. And that big push on the tough on crime was going after what they considered to be super predators. So let's just imagine this, right? You're a young black male walking down the street, okay? Now, if, like I said, the federal government is now moving towards, passing legislation that makes it easier for law enforcement to stop you because you're literally labeled a super predator, that's going to be a problem for you, right? And the argument is that's an issue that individuals who can be classified as white don't have to experience, right? So that would be another example, right? So white privilege is not being, categorically labeled, a super predator within our society, right? And not being targeted by police for anything. Like I said, it's going to be one of those deals where you're not being targeted. Essentially, what it is you're being targeted by police. So, say if you're an African American male, you're being targeted simply because of your superficial characteristics, right? Your skin tone, you're black. If you're Hispanic, you're being profiled because you're Hispanic, and that's the reason for the stop. Okay, as opposed to somebody who's white who would not be stopped because they were white. Okay, so that's what this is arguing, right? That's going to be my interpretation of this. That's going to be how I view it. Okay, now like I said, right now there's a lot of back and forth on social media. There's a lot of back and forth, just everywhere. It's research and just a lot of people arguing back and forth. I'm not even just talking about just on social media. I'm talking about academically, what white privilege is and what it isn't. Okay, so this is something that's definitely ongoing. Okay, but that's going to be my take on it. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. So any more time on this. So let's go get moving. All right, institutional racism. We've talked about. Well, we kind of talked about institutional racism, right? As far as law enforcement, maybe schools, educations. You guys probably see, maybe institutional racism when it comes to, Ivy League school applications. However you want to look at that. And then we have this interesting, and I find it to be very interesting idea, colorism, right? So this is another kind of prejudice, but this prejudice is going to involve people of the same group. Okay, so this is going to be in-group prejudice based on skin type or skin color or some kind of physical characteristic. Okay, so studies suggest that darker-skinned African American males experience more discrimination than lighter-skinned African Americans. So this is the brown paper bag test, right? And some people will argue this doesn't exist. Some people argue that it does. It depends on who you ask, right? There was a sorority, I believe it was AKA. It was African American sorority. And like I said, some people argue that this didn't happen. Some people argue that it did. But the allegation was that in order to be part of AKA, you had to be lighter than a brown paper bag. And if you were not, you were not granted admission into the sorority. Okay, so and we've seen this a lot with other countries. Like we talk about India, the whole market for creams that bleach people's skin so that they're fairer because that's going to be the preferred appearance, fair skin tone. So colorism, simply that preference for lighter skin within a group. So in-group racism or colorism. Racism, we've talked about racism a little bit, right? And I'm sure you guys know what racism is, right? It's a stronger type of prejudice used to justify the belief that one racial category is somehow superior or inferior to others, right? And I'm not going to spend too much time on this. It's pretty much just a concept that you should be familiar with already. Racial steering is something that I find fascinating. It's something I argue it still happens to some extent. And racial steering, what it is just it was a practice of steering minorities, and in this example would be African Americans, into certain communities that were designated for African Americans. So the idea was, if you're African American, you could have all the money that you want. You could have, you could be loaded financially. And if you wanted to buy a house in an area that was designated for whites only, you couldn't buy that house. Okay, that was not a privilege you had. No matter how much money you had, you still were not allowed to live wherever you want. You couldn't live wherever you want or wanted to. Okay. So that's what racial steering is, right? This has been a huge. There's been a lot of research done on this. Like I said, this is something that still happens today. I'd argue, like I said, not too long ago there was a case of a woman who sued an apartment complex because she applied for an apartment. She was black. They told her that the apartment was no longer available, and she continued to search for an apartment, and she kept seeing that apartment that she was denied because it wasn't available. So, long story short, she found out that, the reason why they didn't give it to her is because she was black. So, that would be maybe a modern day example of racial steering, but that's what it was. Okay, redlining. it's the same thing. It's mortgages. So essentially, redlining is going to be handing out mortgages to households in certain communities, or for communities that are designated to be white or black. Okay, we've seen that in LA. Venice Beach had an example of that. When Venice Beach was being built, it was not intended for minorities, particularly blacks. So there are certain communities or certain sections of Venice Beach that were designated for black residents because those residents were the ones who were building Venice Beach. There's an entire book on it, but I find it interesting that these individuals could work there, but they couldn't travel outside that area that was designated for them. All right, and the Green Book, which is something we'll talk about later. I'll probably make that your discussion video. Sedimentation, I'm going to go over. All right, so these are just some concepts that you should just be familiar with. Genocide, which is the deliberate annihilation of a particular racial, ethnic, religious group. Okay, so that's pretty much going to be the the progression of prejudice, discrimination, racism, and then you have something as horrible as genocide. Excuse me. Okay. All right, now for segregation, there's two types of segregation. This will be a test question. So segregation refers to the physical separation of two groups, particularly in residence, but also in workplace and social functions. So you guys, I'm sure, familiar with this. We've all taken English classes, history classes where we've seen, signs like this, right? No dogs, no Negroes, no Mexicans, right? You imagine that, walking into a restaurant or walking up to a restaurant and seeing a sign that said no dogs, no Negroes, and no Mexicans. And down at this point now, they literally lump you in with the dogs. So they'll let you know exactly how they feel about you, right? And I personally never experienced anything like this, but I have friends and family that have. I know somebody who's old enough to have lived in a time where, like, diners were segregated. This person has told me they remember as a little kid walking into a restaurant and being in that restaurant. And this person was Hispanic, okay, or is Hispanic. And but they're fair, they're light, and walking into a segregated restaurant, and the owners telling them, because they were friendly with the owners telling them that they didn't have to sit on that side, which was the black side, that they could sit over on the white side because they were light enough to pass or to be okay to sit on that side. Like, this person is in their 80s, and they remember this, okay? So if you haven't had a chance, totally off topic and aside, if you ever had a chance to talk to somebody in their 70s and their 80s, talk to them, and they'll tell you some amazing stories. I couldn't imagine that. So for segregation, you have two types. You have de jure segregation, and you have de facto segregation. Okay, so de jure segregation is a segregation that's going to be enforced by law. So essentially, there's going to be some kind of ordinance. It's illegal for you as a minority or black person to be in this place, to use this facility, to this, that, or the other. Okay, so it's going to be outlined by law. And you have de facto segregation, which is segregation that occurs without laws, but because of other factors. So an example of this would be, like, maybe I'm driving with my family and I pull up into a gas station. Now, there's no law that says I can't pump gas, right, at this gas station. But that's going to be a gas station that's going to be really only for white people, right? So maybe some people that work there, maybe some people that are hanging outside there may say something to me, may make a comment, may harass me, okay? That would be an example of de facto segregation. So segregation that's not enforced by law, it's going to be forced by some kind of social sanction for you, being there. Okay, so those are the two that I want you to be familiar with. Okay, and these concepts too are just kind of things I want you to be familiar with. I'm not going to press you too hard on them. So essentially, you have two concepts when it comes to assimilation within the United States. You have pluralism, which some people would consider to be the ideal form of assimilation, which means that we're all in the same bowl, but we're still, individual pieces, like a salad, right? If you got a salad, you have your tomatoes, they're in the bowl, but there's still tomatoes, there's still avocados, there's still carrots, whatever it is you put in your salad, right? There's still a crouton, whatever that is. We're all in the same bowl, we're all in the same country, but we get to still be individuals, right? We still get to keep our culture, our backgrounds, or we still get to be what we are, even though we're still in the same bowl. Assimilation is going to be the melting pot ideal, right? So you have pluralism, which is salable, and assimilation, which is a melting pot. And this argues that the best way, or the best method for immigrants is to essentially melt into their new host land. So essentially forget their cultural backgrounds, forget whatever ethnicities they may have been in whatever countries they're from, and now that you're here in this country, you are, let's say American, you are American now. So you let go of all that cultural baggage and you adopt this whole new identity as an American, right? And you all melt into this one kind of homogenous American culture, right? So that would be a melting pot theory. Okay. An amalgamation is essentially going to be the idea of mixing of races, right? So, interracial marriages were illegal not too long ago, like in the 1960s, late almost 70s. It was still illegal for a white man or white woman to marry a black woman or black man. So essentially they had laws making it illegal for you to marry somebody outside of your race. I couldn't imagine. I'd lose my mind right now if somebody told me I couldn't marry somebody because of their race or their religion, right? That's not something we live with today. But it's something we had to live with, and it wasn't too long ago. Okay, so amalgamation is just the process by which a minority group and a majority group combine to form a new group, right? So this is kind of the melting pot idea, but gone a little further. Okay, so that's going to do it for race.